Wyoming Territory, June 1884, the stagecoach door slammed so hard it rattled the windows, and Calla Bridger stumbled as a firm hand shoved her out onto the dusty street of Buffalo. Her boots struck the ground hard, and her wedding dress, still white despite the long ride, swept the dirt as she turned to look back. But the man she had married just 2 days prior did not meet her eyes. "I changed my mind," he said flatly, then climbed back inside without another word. The driver raised his brows but cracked the reins, and the wheels shrieked as the stagecoach lurched forward. Calla stood frozen in the middle of the road, her chest hollow, her veil fluttering against her shoulder, and her heart pounding like a runaway horse. People stared. A woman held her child's hand a little tighter. A shopkeeper leaned out from his doorway, frowning. Calla's cheeks burned, but she did not cry. She would not. She turned slowly, her suitcase still strapped to the back of the coach, already disappearing down the road. "Well," she whispered to herself, brushing the dust from her skirt, "I suppose that's that." "You all right, miss?" came a voice low and steady behind her. She turned and squinted against the sun. A tall man stood beside the livery stable, a saddle over one shoulder, his shirt rolled to the elbows. Rough hands, sun-darkened skin, and eyes like the sky right before rain blew, but not soft. "I am fine," she said, though her voice cracked on the last word. She straightened. "Just a change of plans." He set the saddle down gently. "That man your husband?" Calla swallowed. "Yes, no." "I suppose not anymore." He nodded once, like that made perfect sense. "Name's Elias Norwood." She hesitated, then said, "Calla Bridger." They stood quiet for a moment. Then Elias stepped forward, took off his hat, and said, "Then let me explain why you matter." Her brow furrowed. "Why would you say something like that?" He looked at her, real and steady. "Because no man with sense sends a woman off like that, and because I reckon you are standing there wondering if you are the problem." She said nothing. "I got a spare room above the stable. Belongs to my sister, but she married last year and moved to Cheyenne. It is clean and safe. You can stay until you figure what comes next." Calla stared at him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You deserve better than that." She did not nod. She did not thank him. She just followed him. The room was small but tidy. A cot, a wash basin, and a window that faced the West Hills. Calla sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tight in her lap. The dress itched, and she hated it now, hated how foolish she felt. Elias brought her stew an hour later, left it without fuss, and said, "I will be downstairs if you need anything." The next morning, she found work at the mercantile folding calico and sorting beans. She took off the wedding dress and wore the one she had arrived in the territory with. People still stared, but less now. She walked with her chin up. Elias never asked her what had happened. He just made sure the fire was lit at night and that she had coffee in the mornings. He was quiet but never cold. By the second week, she started bringing dinner down to the stable in the evenings. They ate on crates turned into a table, the horses shifting in their stalls. "You grew up around here?" she asked one night as the sun sank low. "No," he said. "Texas came north after the war." "Too many ghosts down there," she nodded. "I came from Missouri. My father died when I was 16, my mother after that. The man I married," she stopped. Her throat tightened. "You do not have to tell me." "I want to," she said. "His name was Milton. He wrote letters for a year. Promised a farm near Sheridan. Promised a future. Then he saw me in person and decided I was not what he wanted." Elias said nothing, just shifted his jaw like he was biting down on something hard. The next morning, she found a new dress folded outside her door. Simple but well made. She never asked how he afforded it. She just wore it with a quiet kind of pride. By midsummer, Calla knew the town's rhythm. She knew Elias always fed the horses before himself, that he carved small wooden animals when he thought no one was watching, that he always checked the sky before turning in like he was waiting for something. One evening, when the stars were just starting to show, she came down to the stable and found him brushing down a gray mare. He looked up, surprised to see her with 2 tin cups in hand. "I thought maybe you would want coffee," she said, suddenly shy. He smiled faintly. "I would." They stood side by side, drinking in silence. "You are kind," she said softly. "I do not know why, but you are." "Because someone ought to be," Elias said. "You are not a burden, Calla." You have never been, she looked up at him. You never asked me what I want. I figured you would tell me when you were ready, she nodded. I want to stay if that is all right. His eyes searched hers. It is more than all right. They did not kiss then, not yet. But something settled in the air between them. A week later, word came that Milton had sold the farm and left the territory entirely. Calla walked to the edge of the pasture, the sun warm on her face. Elias found her there, his hat in hand. I suppose I am free now, she said. You always were, he replied. She turned to him, really turned. You said you wanted to explain why I matter. I did. Then do it. Elias stepped closer. His voice was rough but steady. You matter because you stayed kind when you could have turned hard. Because you do not need anyone, but still, you give people pieces of yourself, because you look me in the eye like I am worth something. And because every day since you walked off that stagecoach, I have been hoping you would stay. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. I have been hoping the same. And then he kissed her, not rushed, not desperate, but real, like he meant it, like she mattered. And she did. By early July, the town's air turned thick with heat, the kind that pressed down on skin and made every chore feel twice as hard. Calla had taken to rising before the sun, pulling her hair into a knot and walking to the well barefoot to draw water before the wind picked up the dust. Elias had started leaving his hat on the hook outside the stable door, and she knew now it meant he was nearby, not out on the range or hauling feed from the stockyard. It was a small thing, but she noticed it. She noticed everything. Late one afternoon, she stood on the porch of the mercantile, watching two wagons roll in from the southern road. One carried sacks of flour and sugar from Rollins. The other bore a coffin, the unpainted pine stark against the red dust that clung to its corners. The blacksmith's boy stepped out of the second wagon and handed over a folded paper to the undertaker without a word. Calla turned and walked back to the stables, wiping her hands on her apron, her breath uneven. Inside, Elias was brushing burrs from a bay gelding's tail. He looked over his shoulder but didn't stop working. There was a coffin on the second wagon, she said. I heard, he answered, combing slow and careful. Old man Crispin's youngest fell off a sheep trail near Ten Sleep, broke his neck. She leaned against the stall door, arms folded. His mother's been walking to the church every morning since April. I don't think she'll stop now. She might not, he said. Grief makes its own rules. She looked at him. Did yours? He set down the comb. Didn't think you'd ask me that. I didn't think I would either, she said. But I want to know. He stepped out of the stall, dusted his hands. My brother Joseph died at Shiloh. We were in the same regiment. I held his hand when it happened. Didn't tell our folks for a week after. Couldn't write it down. Calla didn't speak right away. Then she said, I never fought in a war, but I still know what it feels like to lose the only person who made you feel real. Elias looked at her then, and not like he had before. Something in his expression settled, like a door opening slowly rather than being pushed. Would you walk with me later? He asked. There's a trail behind the ridge. I used to ride it, but I'd rather walk it now. She nodded. I'd like that. They left just before dusk, taking the narrow path behind the stable where the grass grew high and the air smelled of sage. He didn't offer her his arm, and she didn't ask for it. They walked beside each other, the silence not empty but full of what neither of them needed to say. After a while, Elias stopped by a cottonwood tree and sat on a low boulder. Calla joined him, brushing her skirt beneath her knees. I used to think I'd never settle anywhere for long, he said. Didn't feel right putting down roots when everything I'd grown up with was gone. She turned toward him slightly. And now there's someone who makes this place feel like more than just land and chores. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes I still wonder why he changed his mind. Part of me wants to know, and part of me hopes I never do. Elias let out a slow breath. You don't owe that man understanding. You never did. I know, she whispered. It's just hard to unlearn the ache. He didn't answer right away. Then he reached down and picked up a small stone, turning it in his palm before setting it back down. I'd like to build a second stall next month, he said. There's talk of a family moving in from Nebraska, might bring 2 mares. I could use the help. Calla lifted her eyes to his. You want me to stay? I want you to belong, he said. She blinked once, then again. A breeze stirred the hem of her dress. Then she said, "I don't know what tomorrow brings, Elias, but I want to belong too." He didn't smile, not exactly, but his face warmed in a way that made her feel steadier than she had in weeks. They walked back in the dark, the moon just rising, thin and pale. When they reached the stable, Elias paused and said, "Do you want me to walk you up?" She shook her head. "I know the way," but before she turned, she reached out and touched his hand. Brief, but enough. He watched her climb the stairs in silence, then turned and went back to the horses. She left the window open that night, and the air that came through was cool and clean. The August wind came down hard from the bighorns, rattling the cottonwoods and stripping the first yellow leaves from their branches. Calla stood behind the stable, her hands wrapped around a length of rope, watching Elias measure the new lumber stacked along the rear wall. He ran his hand along one of the planks, then crouched to inspect the edge with a carpenter's eye, not a rancher's. His back was to her, but she could tell he was thinking something he did with his whole body, still and deliberate. "Did you build anything back in Texas?" she asked, shifting her grip on the rope. He didn't turn. "A chicken coop once fell apart in a storm. My father said I'd better stick to saddles." She smiled faintly. "You ever think about building a house?" He stood then, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "I think about it most mornings now." He looked at her fully. "But not just any house. One that faces east so the kitchen gets the light, a porch deep enough for 2 chairs and coffee in the rain. A place that's not just for sleeping." Calla felt something tighten low in her chest. "You have land?" "Not yet, but I've been speaking to Mr. Cargill. He's selling off the far ridge down past the cotton fields. Soil's good enough for a garden. Room for chickens too, if you're feeling brave." She stepped closer to the fence. "You said you didn't think you'd settle. Now you're talking porches and gardens." "I didn't think I'd find someone I wanted to build beside." The rope slipped from her fingers, forgotten. "And you think that's me?" "I know it is." They stood without speaking for a long moment, the wind tugging at her braid. Then she said, "I'd want a room for sewing with a window that faces west and a stove that doesn't smoke." "I can manage that," he said. The wind shifted then, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke not from town but faint and distant. She turned her head, frowning. "Someone camping nearby?" she asked. "Could be," Elias said. "Or it's the McAllister boys burning brush again. They don't much care for who's downwind of their mess." That night, he brought her up a crate of early apples from a trader in Red Fork. She peeled them over the basin while he patched his only good shirt, needle awkward in his strong fingers. "You ever sew before?" she asked, watching the thread twist. "Not unless I'm desperate." She reached for the shirt. "You'll ruin it if you keep like that." He let her take it. "I'd rather it be yours anyway." She looked up at him, the needle paused. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." The apple peels dried in curls on the windowsill. She finished mending the shirt and handed it back, careful not to brush his fingers, but he didn't pull away when they touched. Later, when the lamp was low and the wind quieted, she lay awake listening to the horses shift below her. Something had settled in her that hadn't been there before, a knowing, not a hoping. A life could be made here. Not just survived, but built. In the morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Elias was already working, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening his collar. She stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed over her apron, and called out, "You're starting without a plan." He looked up, squinting in the sun. "I've got one. Just haven't written it down." She came down barefoot, stepping over shavings. "Then tell me out loud." He set the hammer down and leaned against the frame. "First the stall, then the fencing, then, if you still want to, we talk to Cargill, and after," he didn't blink, "then we build a house. One with a sewing room and a clean stove." Calla was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You forgot the porch chairs." "I didn't forget," he said, "just didn't want to assume." She looked at him long and steady. "I'll need one with arms for leaning back at the end of the day." He nodded. "I'll make it myself." And that was how they began. Not with promises whispered under stars, but with wood and rope and the slow hammering of something true. The last of the summer storms came in low and sudden, rolling east over the hills with a sky the color of lead and a wind that bent the wheatgrass flat. Calla was hauling a sack of oats from the mercantile when she saw Elias across the yard, sleeves soaked to the elbows, pulling the new stall's roof tarp into place before the rain hit full. She dropped the oats on the porch and ran to help, skirts catching the wind. He didn't argue when she reached for the far side of the canvas, both of them straining against the gale until it was tied down taut. By the time they ducked back under the overhang, their clothes were stuck to their skin, hair plastered to their foreheads. Elias leaned against the wall, catching his breath while the rain came down in sheets. "You didn't have to run out like that. I wasn't about to let your hard work get ruined," she said, pushing hair off her brow. "Besides, I've been wet before." He looked at her, eyes narrowed slightly, not from suspicion but from something quieter. "You didn't flinch when the wind kicked up. Most folks would have turned back." "I don't turn back," she said plainly. He nodded once. "I know." Later that evening, the storm passed. Calla hung her dress near the stove to dry and wrapped herself in one of Elias's flannels while she boiled potatoes with salt and caraway. He sat across from her, watching the steam rise in ribbons. "Mrs. Avery came by the stable this morning," he said, breaking the silence. "Said she heard you turned down the schoolhouse job." Calla stirred the pot slowly. "I did. You'd be good with the children." "I don't doubt that," she said, laying the spoon aside. "But it's not what I want." There was no judgment in his voice. "Then what do you want?" She turned from the fire, meeting his eyes. "I want to build something from nothing. I want to work side by side with someone who sees me, not just what I can do for them. And I want to wake up in a place I chose." Elias leaned forward, elbows on knees. "That sounds like the kind of thing a woman should have." "I didn't think I'd get to," she admitted. "But it's starting to feel like maybe I can." The next morning, they rode out to the ridge where Cargill's land sloped gentle toward the river. The soil was dark and damp underfoot, and the ground held the scent of wet clay and cottonwood bark. Calla dismounted and walked the edge of the property, boots sinking slightly with each step. Elias watched her from beside the horses. "What do you think?" She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "There's space here, not just for buildings, for breathing." He nodded. "We can make it ours." They made the agreement with Cargill that same week, trading Elias's old mare and half the year's hay for 5 acres and the promise of labor come spring. No papers were signed, just hands clasped tight and a look shared between two people who honored their word. Days passed into early fall. The mornings turned crisp, and Calla began stitching curtains from muslin scraps saved in a tin box. Elias carved a frame for the front door from a fallen aspen, smoothing the edges until they fit snug and square. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they stood where the foundation stakes were driven, the earth marked and measured beneath their boots. "You sure about this?" Elias asked quietly. Calla didn't answer right away, then she stepped closer, slid her hand into his. "I haven't been sure of many things in my life, but I am sure of you." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "I want to marry you, Calla, not out of obligation and not because it makes things easier. I want to because what we've built it deserves a name." Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. "You're not afraid I'll leave?" "I know you won't." She squeezed his hand once firm. "Then ask me again tomorrow when the sun's up." He smiled, slow and certain. "All right." That night she couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from the quiet thrill of knowing she was choosing this life, this man, on her own terms. The wind whispered through the shutter, and downstairs, Elias's footsteps crossed the stable floor, checking the horses, as always. She lay back, eyes on the ceiling, and whispered aloud, "Let it be morning soon." The morning came in pale and golden, the first frost silvering the edges of the grass. Calla stood barefoot by the basin, brushing her hair with slow strokes, the bristles catching on sleep-tangled strands. Below, she heard Elias's boots cross the yard, measured, familiar, not hurried but not idle either. He didn't knock. She told him not to. He simply stepped into the room, holding a bundle wrapped in linen. "For you," he said, setting it gently on the table. "I traded for it with the saddle I finished last week." She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a bolt of soft, cornflower blue wool. Her fingers ran over it once, then again, as if to be sure it was real. "I thought maybe you'd want it for your wedding dress," he said. "I didn't think I'd wear one again," she whispered, not looking up. "I didn't think I'd ask again," he said. "But here we are." Calla folded the fabric with care. "I'd like to be married in the clearing, with just you and the horses and the wind." "That can be done," he said. They married 3 days later in the hush of early twilight. No preacher, just Mr. Cargill, who had once been a circuit minister before his wife took ill and he put up his collar for good. He spoke the words slow and quiet, and Elias answered them with his eyes fixed on her, not a flicker of doubt in his jaw or shoulders. Calla's voice didn't waver, not once, and when he took her hand in his, she curled her fingers around his like they'd always fit there. After they shared bread and cider with the Cargills and the stable hands. Someone played a fiddle, and though Elias didn't dance, he kept her close while others moved around them. That night, in the small room above the stable, he unpinned her braid as though he were handling something delicate, not fragile. She reached for him with the same steadiness she showed at the loom, and in the fields no hesitation, no fear, just choice, just love. By November, the house was framed and roofed, the walls tight against the prairie wind. Calla stood at the hearth and ran her hand along the smooth curve of the mantel Elias had carved. She'd sewn curtains for the kitchen window and laid a braided rug near the stove, its colors pulled from the scraps of clothes she no longer wore. "Next spring," he said one evening, wiping sawdust from his forearm, "I'll dig the fence posts deep enough to hold through snow. Then we'll plant." She sat at the table, darning one of his work shirts. "What would you like to grow? Tomatoes, beans, maybe some squash, but mostly I want to see what takes root." Snow fell early that winter, soft and steady. They kept warm with stacked wood in each other. He read aloud from a worn almanac while she worked her needle. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it was with weight and surety. No drift, no doubt. In the quiet hours, he would trace the inside of her wrist with his thumb, as though memorizing the beat of her life. She would press her face against his chest and breathe in the scent of ash and wool and him. The town no longer stared when she passed. They greeted her by name. The children at the mercantile called her Mrs. Norwood and offered her wildflowers, which she dried and tucked between pages of Elias's old journal. One morning, as the first thaw softened the ground, she pressed his hand to her belly. "There's something coming," she said simply. He didn't speak. Just lowered his head until it rested against hers. By summer, their child was born, a girl with Elias's dark brows and Calla's quiet eyes. They named her Ruth, after the woman who once taught Calla to sew in Missouri, the one who said, "Take up space, you're allowed." Years passed. The stable thrived, the house stood firm through wind and fire season. They built a second room, then a third. Ruth learned to braid a horse's mane before she could read. She followed her father into the fields and listened to her mother's stories at nightfall, stories not of sorrow, but of choosing again and choosing right. Calla kept the bolt of blue wool in a cedar chest. She never cut it. She said she wanted Ruth to have it someday, to use not for a dress, but for whatever she needed most, and Elias. He never missed supper. Not once. When they were old, they sat on the porch they'd once dreamed of, 2 chairs side by side, watching the sun go down over the ridge they'd made theirs. He reached for her hand every night, just as he did the first time, not because he needed to, but because he still wanted to.